Thank you for joining Let's Meet Where We Eat, conversations with innovation and entrepreneurship leaders who specialize in food and nutrition. Our series is presented by Nourish Cafe and the Food and Nutrition Innovation Institute at the Tufts Friedman School for Nutrition Science and Policy. Enjoy. I run the Tufts University Food and Nutrition Innovation Institute, which Dana is a member of through the National Dairy Council, and Melissa Martinelli's been a part of through her startup Superfrau. And I may have other of our members. Let's see, Megan O'Hearn from Audacious. I see you here. So there's other folks who are also members of the council. And if you're not a member of the council and you're just here joining us, we put these together because we realized if you're not part of the Food Nutrition Innovation Council at our institute, we didn't want to be selfish about hogging all of the great intelligence that we get to hear from all the time. And one of the theories of change I had when I came to this job was, I'm at Tufts University with the only school of nutrition in the country. We have a big microphone. And I always said what I want to do with that microphone is hand it to other people, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is our opportunity literally to just hand the mic to somebody else on our council who's doing amazing work. We asked them to put together a program that we could share with all of you. If any of you represent companies that are interested in joining our leadership council, let me know. You can get in touch with us. And at a minimum, we're just so glad that you're all here with us today. We got a fantastic program that's going to happen. I believe, I just want to recognize Hallie Malley, who's here. Hallie, raise your hand. And Nicole Nintu. Nicole, you're there. They're my team. And so we run the Innovation Institute together. I think, Hallie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm really just turning over the mic to Dana, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So Dana, I'm going to turn the mic over to you to introduce yourself. And like I said, you guys eat, enjoy. We're going to ask questions. It's going to be dynamic. Don't be shy. You can also use the Zoom chat as a place to engage in conversation. So with that, Dana, thank you, friend. And I turn it to you.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to the Tufts Food and Nutrition Innovation Council for hosting today's membership Spotlight Series. And thank you to all of you for joining the National Dairy Council's Discover the Hidden Health Benefits Beyond the Nutrition Facts label. So I'm Dana Engel. I'm a public health registered dietitian and vice president of regulatory affairs at National Dairy Council. NDC is a nonprofit organization founded by U.S. dairy farmers committed to advancing nutrition science and education. Since 1915, we've brought together a team of dietitians, researchers, and communicators to provide credible, science-based information on dairy's role in healthy eating patterns. As a checkoff organization, NDC supports public health through education, but does not and cannot attempt to influence policy. Today's session is all about rethinking how to evaluate the healthfulness of food. The nutrition facts label has its place, but it doesn't tell the whole story. That's where the food matrix comes in, the physical and nutritional structure of a food and how its components interact in the body. We've structured the session in 3 parts today. First, we'll lay the scientific foundation. Dr. Julie Hess will kick us off with a powerful overview of the food matrix concept, followed by Dr. Allison Unger, who will dive into the dairy food matrix specifically, where emerging science is challenging conventional wisdom about nutrients like saturated fat. Second, we'll host a panel of experts to explore the practical implications, how the food matrix can shape public health guidance, consumer communication, and innovation. And then finally, we'll open up the floor to your questions and insights. And we won't stop for Q&A during the presentation or the panel, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat or hold on to them for our discussion segment of this Lunch and Learn. So to start us off, we'll hear from Dr. Julie Hess. She's recorded her presentation in advance and she's traveling today, but she'll join us live for the panel discussion. So let's get started. Join us as we explore how the food matrix can unlock a deeper understanding of the true health benefits of food. So just bear with me for 1 second as I share my screen and Julie's presentation.
Hi, my name is Julie Hess. I'm a research nutritionist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service, and I'm based in Grand Forks, North Dakota at the Grand Forks Human Nutrition Research Center. It's my pleasure to be able to present to you today foundational science about the food matrix. To start with my disclosures, I am of course a current USDA employee, and I'm a former employee of the National Dairy Council. So today I'm going to be talking through the origins and history behind the concept of the food matrix, as well as a definition and some examples. Next, I'll go through applications of the food matrix concept in current research. How is this body of research being used? And finally, what's next? Where is research on the food matrix headed? So when we ask this question, why discuss the food matrix? I would say that the answer really starts with scurvy. So nutrition science really kicked off with this observation that certain foods cured or helped with certain diseases. And a good example is the observation by the British Navy that providing lemon juice as part of a standard sailor's diet eradicated scurvy, which was the scourge of the seas. And of course, this is because citrus fruits, like a lot of other fresh fruits and vegetables, are a rich source of vitamin C, which prevents scurvy. So the discovery of nutrients, vitamins, and minerals beginning with the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century led to the eradication of other diseases like scurvy that were related to nutrient deficiency. So pellagra related to a niacin deficiency, rickets related to a vitamin D deficiency, and others. And initially it was thought that the same concept could apply to what we now consider chronic conditions, things like cardiovascular disease and cancer and type 2 diabetes and others. And as we know, this approach was much less successful with chronic conditions. These conditions, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, can't be treated with vitamin C or calcium or vitamin A. And this really led to what's been framed as a reductionist critique of nutrition science or nutritionism. This idea that focusing on the specific nutrient contents of foods or of the diet was more important and was likely to reduce the risk of disease rather than considering the overall food or the overall diet. So you may remember the deluge of fat-free foods onto the market in the 90s, such as a certain fat-free chocolate cookie or sugar-free foods on the market in the aughts. These are both examples of nutritionism. If fat causes heart disease, then surely the most important thing to do is to decrease fat in the diet. And as long as a cookie is fat-free or low-fat or sugar-free, then it's actually good for you, right? And the same approach wasn't just adopted with nutrients of public health concern with fat and sugar. The same nutritionism approach was also adopted with beneficial nutrients. And I have a couple examples on this slide that I want to talk through briefly. So in the 80s and 90s, epidemiological studies suggested that beta-carotene in the diet was beneficial and may have a protective health effect on cancer incidence. But when studies were conducted with beta-carotene supplements, it was found that taking beta-carotene in supplement form could actually increase the incidence of certain cancers or have no impact on them at all, instead of the protective role that was observed with foods that were rich in beta-carotene. So this finding suggests that there's something more complex in the relationship between beta-carotene-rich foods and cancer incidence than just the beta-carotene itself. And similarly, we all know that eating fish, especially oily fish, can help reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. But a meta-analysis from 2018 indicates that consuming just fish oil in the form of a supplement isn't protective against cardiovascular conditions in the same way. So again, this isn't a one-to-one relationship between fish oil and CVD risk. It's not vitamin D, vitamin C, and scurvy. And that brings us to this food matrix concept, the idea that the food is more than the sum of the nutrients within it. So I know Dr. Unger is going to provide more technical details in the next presentation, but to kick us off here, the food matrix is broadly defined as the interaction of nutrients, bioactive components, and the chemical and physical structure of a food. That is, what is unique to the components of a food and their interactions that is distinguishable from single components in isolation. Food is more than the sum of its nutrients. So I also want to highlight two important features of the food matrix highlighted in a recent review of the food matrix. That the food matrix influences the metabolic fate of nutrients and subsequently the health effects of those nutrients, and that food processing affects the food matrix and hence modulates the relation between nutrients and health. So the food matrix influences nutrient intake, digestion, and absorption, in turn leading to health effects that differ from what can be expected based on the nutrient composition of the food alone. So this table is adapted from a really excellent review article on the matrix issue in relationship to processed foods that was published in the Journal of Food Science last year. There are a few foods for which the food matrix has been studied, and I wanted to provide a few examples here and go through them. Dr. Unger is going to provide more details on the dairy matrix, which is by far the best characterized of all the food matrices. And she's also going to talk more about saturated fat and heart disease risk in more depth as well. So I do want to note that this is by no means an exhaustive list of all the foods for which the food matrix effects have been studied, but I also want to note that the findings in all of these studies indicate that there's a need for further investigation. So by its nature, studying the food matrix and identifying which aspects of a food may be responsible for its impact on health is really challenging and complex. And research methods, as we all know, especially for observational research in nutrition, are continuously being refined and have a lot of limitations. So the first research I want to talk through is on almonds, and I think this is an especially good illustration of the food matrix concept. So in this study, participants consumed about 30 almonds a day, and the participants consumed them in different forms, either whole unroasted almonds, whole roasted almonds, chopped roasted almonds, or almond butter. And the researchers found that more calories were absorbed when participants ate the almond butter than when they ate the chopped roasted almonds, the whole roasted almonds, or the whole unroasted almonds in that order. So the authors hypothesized that the processing of the almonds, or how processed the almonds had been, impacted the calories that were available for absorption by disrupting the cell walls of the almond and changing the particle size of the almond that were ingested. There's also been some research on the beef matrix. So a frequent message we hear is that red meat is not particularly healthy and its consumption should be limited, in part due to the fact that beef is a source of saturated fat, which is recommended to limit in the diet. So when beef is considered in the context of an otherwise healthy diet, this review article states that there's no adverse effect of consuming beef on health markers. This is an example that's a little bit beyond the food matrix. It alludes to a diet matrix, that it's not just interactions within a food itself, it's also the interaction of that food within the context of the overall diet. So a recent meta-analysis also found that eating beef doesn't impact LDL cholesterol levels, and the authors postulate that the fatty acid profile of beef, which includes high stearic acid content along with monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids, none of which are linked to elevated LDL levels, may be responsible for the lack of impact. So there's research that should be published later this year from the USDA's Beltsville Human Nutrition Research Center, which also indicates that an overall dietary pattern seems to mitigate even the intake of processed meats. So again, this idea that's bigger than the food matrix of the diet matrix, or how does an overall healthy diet maybe protect us from some potential negative impacts or unhealthful impacts of certain foods. There's also an example of food matrix effect related to cereals. This study found that pasta, specifically a physical structure of pasta from extruding and drying pasta leading to a specific microstructure, is really compact and dense, and it might be responsible for a lower glycemic response observed when participants ate 100% refined wheat pasta versus other products prepared with refined wheat, such as bread. So this study is a little bit older, but it's a favorite of my students and another interesting example of a case study in the context of food matrix research. So in this study, fasted participants consumed 300 calorie snack of a beverage, a soup, or a solid food. And these were all essentially made up of the same food. So the beverage was apple juice. Their soup options were apple soup, chicken soup, and peanut soup, or solid foods, a whole apple, a piece of chicken breast, or peanuts, whole peanuts. So the researchers found that beverages, the apple juice, had the weakest satiety impact, and soups, the apple soup, peanut soup, and chicken soup, had the strongest impact on satiety. So this effect may be similar to what we see with almonds, where the blended apple, chicken, and peanuts, or that is peanut butter, had more energy accessible than we had even from the whole foods, from the whole chicken breast, or the whole apple, or the whole peanuts. And this may lead to a lower satiety impact. So what you may be observing or noticing is that some of these broader papers use the term food matrix to explain results of observational studies that otherwise seem antithetical to what we know or recommend about specific food components, especially saturated fatty acids. So to me, this indicates just how underdeveloped this area of research is on the food matrix and underscores that nutrition science itself is a relatively young field. So dietary guidance has encouraged us for years now to monitor our saturated fat intake, but the reality of which saturated fats may be more or less beneficial for health might be more complex, and right now the food matrix concept encompasses questions like this one, while also referring to real observed differences between different forms of the same food. So I do want to spend a minute talking about how this food matrix concept has appeared in the dietary guidelines in the US. So first I want to provide some grounding for us, make sure we're all on the same page with the evidence base for the dietary guidelines for Americans. The dietary guidelines, of course, is the policy document that informs school breakfast and school lunch programs, as well as the Women, Infants, and Children Supplemental Nutrition Program, known as WIC, and child and adult care feeding programs. And it's developed based on an evidence literature review that's conducted by external advisors. And that literature review is known as the Scientific Report of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, or I'll refer to it as the DGAC. So to date, the food matrix concept has not appeared in the Dietary Guidelines for American policy document, but it has appeared in a few DGAC reports. The first time it shows up in the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, it's mentioned in the context of supplements, multivitamin, multimineral supplements, and how they may interact with food. The concept of the food matrix also appears in the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, talking about the body of research on saturated fats in human milk or breast milk as a limitation to research that we have to date, that we don't fully understand the structure of human milk. And then finally, most recently in the 2025 Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Report, dietary patterns are mentioned, that they can capture a number of facets of eating behaviors as well as interactive elements of the overall diet matrix. So this isn't specifically the concept of the food matrix, but it does touch on the concept of the overall diet matrix, how foods in a diet interact with each other. And so while the 2025 Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee report doesn't specifically discuss the food matrix concept, only the diet matrix concept, they were the first committee to evaluate food sources of saturated fat. So as I mentioned earlier, and I know Dr. Unger will be addressing in the next presentation, there's some evidence that not all food sources of saturated fat have the same impact on cardiovascular health outcomes. But this statement, consuming foods lower in saturated fat may be related to decreased cardiovascular disease risk through their lower saturated fat content, as well as the other nutritional exposures within these foods, such as beneficial dietary factors like fiber or antioxidants. This alludes to the fact that the lower cardiovascular disease risk observed in the past from eating fewer foods high in saturated fat may not be only through the lower saturated fat content, but it might also be through other nutrients components of these foods that are low in saturated fats. That is through a matrix effect. So speaking of the 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, on this slide I've just pulled out a few conclusion statements from their review of the relationship between food sources of saturated fat and the risk of cardiovascular disease. There are dozens of conclusion statements like this one on this topic. If you want to read more about them, they're on the Nutrition Evidence Systematic Review website for the Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee. But on this slide, I just pulled one example from each category of strength of evidence. So one statement that's supported by strong evidence, one with moderate, one with limited, and one where there's not enough research to assign a grade. And I really wanted to include this in part to highlight that the statement that's supported by strong evidence, replacing butter with plant-based oils and spreads with predominantly unsaturated fatty acids, does not affect HDL-C or triglyceride levels, that's the only statement for which there was strong evidence on the scientific question. Most of the questions that compare red meat with processed meat or white meat or other foods, or compare high and low fat dairy foods to plant-based foods or other foods, have limited evidence or state that the grade is not assignable because there's not enough evidence. And to me, this lack of evidence is one indication of the breadth of research that's still needed on this matrix topic. The dairy matrix is by far the best characterized in the scientific literature, and yet there's not enough evidence to meet the standards set by the Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee to make recommendations based on this literature. So we know where the dietary guidelines is right now, but what's next? Where do we go from here with food matrix research? So as I've mentioned, we have more data on the dairy food matrix than on other foods, and we need more research dedicated to the impact of whole foods versus foods processed in various ways, chopped, cooked, fermented, even how foods are produced, to see if a similar effect holds true for other foods and how. So in a review on the beef matrix, Dr. Korfeld identified the following areas of research needed on the beef matrix, and I think these apply really well to other foods too. So he identified areas for future research on the matrix structure and the composition of staple foods, on the dietary interactions of staple foods in the context of an overall dietary pattern, the impact of staple food matrices on health across the lifespan, and he also mentions the importance of revisiting recommendations that were based on extrapolating findings from observational research, like research that indicates that small and moderate amounts of beef cause harm, and studying these impacts in the full context of a diet. So if you're eating an otherwise healthy diet, do we still see these potential harms of a specific food? And this research, of course, is needed in short-term and long-term studies and with diverse participant bodies. And finally, what does this mean for public health? Is the concept of the food matrix useful for public health? Is the public ready for the concept of the food matrix? So we know that people choose foods based on taste, price, and convenience above other factors. Recommended dietary patterns in the dietary guidelines are developed based on both current consumption and meeting nutrient needs. So as research on the food matrix progresses, the nutrition and food science communities have an opportunity to consider how this emerging science of the food matrix could or should be reflected in dietary guidance in the future. When do we have enough evidence on a food to say that research supports eating different amounts of that food, perhaps in its various forms? And I want to provide an example here just to be really clear, because I've heard this idea of the food matrix used to support the benefit of consuming whole foods or foods with intact food matrices instead of foods that have been refined or processed or formulated. So think about the peanut butter or almond butter example that we discussed earlier. The food matrix of nut butters is not intact. These foods are processed and they're sometimes formulated. Does that mean that it's better to eat whole peanuts or almonds versus peanut butter or almond butter, or any whole food versus a more refined version? We simply don't know yet in most cases. And I think this really neatly encapsulates the research that's yet to be done and all that we don't know on this field yet. And with that, I'll say thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to our panel discussion.
Awesome. I'm now going to hand it over to Dr. Allison Unger.
It's fine, you can walk back.
Thank you, Dana. Okay, thank you everyone for being here today. I'm really excited to compliment Dr. Hess's presentation. She did such a lovely job really giving that strong background and overview on food matrix science. Today, I'm going to be really focusing on the dairy food matrix, which, as Dr. Hess discussed, is really where most of the research on food matrix science sits. And I thought today what would be an interesting way to look at the food matrix would be sort of through a case study of the body of evidence that's emerging or growing, I should say, around whole milk dairy foods and cardiometabolic health. So Dr. Hess already touched on this a little bit, but just briefly, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, or the DGA, have maintained recommendations for consuming less than 10% of saturated fat in the diet for Americans. And this recommendation has been, longstanding, really since the original dietary guidelines from 1980. And this recommendation is really drawing from what we're about to talk about, the diet heart paradigm. And much of that research came out of the earlier parts of the 20th century, really looking again, focusing on dietary fat and its impact on heart health. And so just to kind of give an overview of what this paradigm is, it's the connection between dietary saturated fat leading to increased LDL cholesterol levels in the body, and then this being really the driving factor for cardiovascular diseases. So again, a lot of this work did actually come out of work really around the 1950s. And as Dr. Hess really nicely pointed out, nutrition science is a very young science. And so in the time since then, it has been rapidly advancing. Our understanding of the relationship between diet and health has been evolving. And so I want to talk about some of that latest evidence today and provide some considerations that will shed light on this paradigm and how we might think about it. So I first wanted to touch on LDL cholesterol levels. You may be likely aware when you go to the doctor, you get your blood drawn and they look for your LDL cholesterol levels. And this is really a key biomarker that your physician will use to assess your cardiovascular disease risk. So what we know from, I would say, the past 2 or 3 decades is when you drill down actually into total LDL cholesterol levels, there are LDL particles that are of different sizes that make up this total LDL cholesterol. So these larger LDL particle sizes that might be in your blood, those have been associated with overall having a benign or neutral risk on cardiometabolic health, whereas smaller LDL particles are linked with being more atherogenic, more easily associated with developing plaque formation in the blood vessels and overall having a higher risk. So if you think about 2 people having the same total LDL cholesterol, if someone were to have overall more of these larger LDL cholesterol particles, they may likely have a lower cardiovascular disease risk than somebody who has, for example, more of these smaller LDL particles. So it's possible that total LDL cholesterol is perhaps misrepresenting somebody's cardiovascular disease risk. And I also want to add that just in general, beyond LDL cholesterol, overall understanding of cardiovascular disease as really a complex disease is growing, and the role of lipid metabolism is really broadening as well. So you can see on the slide in the blue, all of these different biomarkers that have actually been, in the past few decades of research, been found as being linked with cardiovascular disease. So there are sort of, 2 questions of, is LDL cholesterol the most appropriate biomarker for cardiovascular disease? And is there even the most appropriate biomarker? Is it maybe perhaps a suite of biomarkers that can give sort of a holistic picture of a person's cardiometabolic health? So more research really needs to be done in this space, but there is research to suggest, again, that the picture is a little bit more complex. I also wanted to touch on dietary saturated fat. And again, looking at sort of the body of literature here, total saturated fat consumption may not be linked with or may not indicate risk of cardiovascular disease. And again, I'm talking about total saturated fat. And the study that I want to use to kind of demonstrate this or point to some questions on this is this 2020 Cochrane Analysis and Systematic Review. This was a systematic review that included 15 randomized control trials. All of these studies were over 2 years in duration. And overall, the authors were looking at data from over 56,000 total participants. And what the authors found and reported on was that there actually was no significant effect from reducing saturated fat consumption on all of these various cardiovascular disease-related endpoints and also mortality-related endpoints. So coming back to, what Dr. Hess had pointed to in her presentation, is it total saturated fat consumption, or is perhaps food source of saturated fat, the food matrix, a better predictor of cardiovascular disease risk? And honing in a little bit more on whole milk dairy foods, which can, again, kind of paint a little bit of a more complex picture. Here is a really landmark study that was published in 2023. What's notable about this study is it is drawing from data from over 80 countries, and also from income levels, low income, middle income, as well as high income countries. And again, data of almost 245,000 participants. And so the authors, through this analysis, found 6 common food groups that were linked with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, and mortality. And many of these you'll see on the right side are likely not surprising when you think about fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, and fish playing a significant role in this healthy eating pattern, but also dairy foods being the 6th core component or food group of this eating pattern. And when the authors actually drilled down into this, Again, it was about 2 servings of dairy per day that was associated with this healthy eating pattern. And most of the dairy foods that were being consumed were actually whole milk dairy foods. And I just want to note, for the sake of time, we won't be going into these, but that PURE study is really representative of the growing body of evidence that's linking dairy foods, regardless of fat level, as neutral to beneficial for cardiometabolic health. So all of that to say, coming back to this image of the diet heart paradigm, the latest evidence indicates that the real story may be more complex. And so again, this is a continual evolution and we are still learning, but overall the body of evidence is sort of pressure testing this perhaps oversimplified paradigm that might require further study. And this brings us to the dairy food matrix, and just want to walk through, hone in a little bit more on this and discuss what are some potential ways that the dairy food matrix could help explain some of these relationships that we're seeing in the body of evidence. Dr. Hess already really nicely discussed the food matrix. It's that, those interactions between nutrients, bioactive components, those being, maybe they are not meeting the same essential nutritional needs as essential nutrients, but they are still linked with being responsible for a change in human health. And then their interaction really within this physical structure of a food. I actually like to talk about the food matrix as a symphony rather than actually just talking about the food matrix. And so I like to think about the nutrients and bioactives, for example, as those musicians and their instruments. One musician is making music, so maybe there's a single nutrient that's been linked with a health effect, but then it really takes all of those musicians to create a symphony or that health impact, if you will. And then continuing to follow that analogy, you can think about really the auditorium of that symphony amplifying the music of the musicians, or for the food, that physical structure perhaps amplifying those health effects of those nutrients and bioactives working together. And just looking at, how does this all come together for the dairy food matrix? So I wanted to start with dairy milk. This is one of the foods within the dairy food group, but it's also really that food source of all of the other dairy foods and products. And so when you think about all of this coming together, dairy milk, for example, it's a liquid matrix. So it's, it's aqueous, it's 87% on average water. And then all of those other solids are suspended. So dairy milk's 13 essential nutrients, which are listed on the slide, bioactive components, carbohydrates are really, again, suspended throughout that matrix. And you can see within, on the right side, just taking a moment to focus on bioactive components, that can include bioactive peptides, bioactive lipids, carbohydrates. Lactose could be considered a bioactive in this case. And so, again, much more work needs to be done in this. So a lot of this research that's pointing to these potential beneficial mechanisms, they're really being drawn from cell models or animal models, but they've been identified in dairy milk. And so the same practice can apply to other foods of how we can start to sort of map out these different bioactive components and their potential health benefits within a food. And I also just wanted to take a moment, of course, because we're talking about saturated fat, and really highlight dairy fat specifically. So while we talk about the saturated fats in dairy, I think also, the dairy fat in itself could be considered a bioactive components that perhaps overlooked. And so, for example, if you think about the dairy milk and that it's got 8 grams of total fat per serving per cup of milk, and about 5 grams of that is saturated. So while the majority of the fat is saturated, I think what can sometimes get lost in translation is that saturated fat is actually this very large umbrella term, and that there's actually many different fatty acids within that category. So there's saturated fatty acids that have maybe short or medium chain, odd chain, branch chain, and they have each been linked with their own potential beneficial mechanisms within when looking at those mechanistic studies. But then also the fat within dairy is packaged within these really unique droplets called the milk fat globule membrane. And that's pictured on the right side of the slide. So you'll see the yellow being the main source of that fat. And then that membrane is a really unique tri-layer lipid membrane. And it's actually very rich in bioactive components, bioactive lipids, bioactive peptides. And you can see on the bottom of the slide some of the potential roles that even those are playing. And again, thinking about the matrix, these droplets are suspended throughout that aqueous solution. So moving now to cheese and yogurt, these are fermented, So the fermentation process can transform milk into foods like yogurt, kefir, also hard cheeses. I'm thinking about cheddar, for example. And when you think about, for example, the matrix of cheese, the processing will take milk and actually form a semi-solid or solid matrix where the protein is really acting as that network. And then all of those other solids are interdispersed throughout that network. So thinking about the 8 essential nutrients of cheese, the bioactive components being distributed throughout. And then thinking about yogurt, there are some similarities there. So the fermentation process by those live and active microbes are again creating a gel-like matrix of different proteins, and it's then being interdispersed with those essential nutrients. Yogurt has 9 essential nutrients and bioactive components. And I also just want to highlight too that the fermentation process can actually perhaps enhance the nutritional value of a food, whereas it's taking some of those components within milk and creating new bioactives as well. And so I just want to talk about some of the research that shows, points to the role of fermentation for dairy foods and how that can be perhaps enhancing the health benefits of these foods or providing complementary health benefits. One of these examples looking at cheese. So cheese is, as we know, high in sodium, high in saturated fat. But in general, in the literature, we see that it does not impact blood lipids in the way we might expect. And so the trial here that I have to sort of encapsulate that is this randomized controlled trial. It was 6 weeks long, and it enrolled over 160 participants. And so all of these participants were consuming the same amount of dairy fat being provided, but in different forms. So group A in blue was consuming all of the dairy fat as a full fat cheddar cheese. In group B, you have all of these participants consuming dairy fat as partly low fat cheddar cheese and then also supplemented with butter. And then in group C, which is in green, we have all these participants consuming the dairy fat as butter. And so what's notable here is that after 6 weeks, we see there's actually a significant stepwise reduction in total cholesterol. You can see here, and then also LDL cholesterol here, where the greatest reduction was seen in participants that were consuming all of their dairy fat within the cheddar cheese. So it really does point to, again, more research is needed, but it's suggesting that that food matrix is really playing a significant role here in how that dairy fat is being digested, absorbed, and those potential health effects. And there's, overall less research that's been conducted on yogurt and the yogurt matrix, but we can point to prospective research and other clinical trials, for example, and see how there may be, a pronounced role of perhaps yogurt and other fermented dairy foods on health. So here I'm just showing a systematic review published in 2021. And this review particularly really reflects research that was conducted over 40 years, over 100 studies were included. And the authors noted that there were consistent beneficial associations between fermented dairy foods and these various health outcomes, thinking about lowered risk for type 2 diabetes, for example, cardiovascular disease, and bone health and other cancers, for example. And I just want to close with this last slide. I think this is kind of giving a little lead into the panel discussion, but I think we may not readily necessarily see how food matrix science is really playing into public health, But I think this FDA qualified health claim can be a great example of that. And so just a little bit more about it. In 2024, the FDA recognized the first ever qualified health claim for yogurt's potential role in reducing type 2 diabetes risk. And so I think this is a great way of seeing that translation of food matrix science to real life impact in public health that can make an impact on the health and well-being of Americans. So with that, I just wanted to close with the key takeaways really being that, you know, the diet heart paradigm has really evolved, and we're seeing this really with dairy foods, with much of that food matrix science being conducted. And we're seeing in the body of evidence that milk, cheese, and yogurt at all fat levels can overall be part of a balanced, healthy eating pattern. And also that the matrix matters, and not just the food matrix, but again, going back to Dr. Hess's presentation, really thinking even broadly to the diet matrix, that dairy foods each have their own unique food matrix that can, within a healthy eating pattern, perhaps help explain why those dairy foods are having benefits for heart health. So with that, I will close my presentation, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Hess and Dr. Unger, for that very compelling and science-rich exploration of the food matrix science and its role in shaping health outcomes. So it's a really powerful reminder, again, that the nutrition facts label only tells part of the story. The structure of food, the way the nutrients and bioactives interact, and the form in which we consume it all influence how our bodies respond. So we're now going to shift into the second part of our session, a panel discussion that brings this science to life through the lens of the real world application. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by 5 phenomenal experts who reflect a diverse cross-section of fields, from federal science and public health to communications, innovation, and sustainable food systems. Together, they'll help us explore how the food matrix can drive meaningful impact. So not just theory, but in practice. So each panelist will take a moment to introduce themselves and share their bold idea, a forward-thinking vision for how this science can reshape their area of work. So feel free again to drop questions in the chat, and we will leave time at the end for Q&A. So I think we're going to try and get started with Dr. Hess. Again, she's traveling, so her connection's a little spotty, but we're going to give it a go. Julie, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me, Dana?
We sure can, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Julie Hess. I'm a research nutritionist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And as you heard me mention in my presentation, I'm based at the Grand Forks Human Nutrition Research Center in Grand Forks, North Dakota. Today, I am traveling through rural Kansas, so we're getting some of that heat wave that I know other folks are feeling too. But I actually got a bachelor's in French and English from the University of Texas at Austin, which is a super normal path for a nutrition PhD. And then ended up going to the University of Minnesota, where I studied under Dr. Joanne Slavin, got my PhD in nutrition. And then my first job out of graduate school was actually with the National Dairy Council. I worked in scientific and regulatory affairs before joining USDA in 2021. And so I've been there for about 4 years now. My lab primarily focuses on identifying barriers to Americans following the dietary guidelines for Americans, because we know we've had these guidelines in place for many years now, and the quality of the American diet is not nearly as close to the quality that's recommended in the dietary guidelines we might like it to be. I'm probably best known for work that my lab did a couple of years ago on how it's possible to follow a dietary guidelines for American eating pattern, while consuming mostly ultra-processed food as it's defined by the NOVA classification system, if you all are familiar. And so that kind of leads me into my bold idea related to the matrix and processed food, in that I think this food matrix idea provides a really exciting framework for future direction for this research on processed food. So we can focus on more physical changes to the structure of the food and how that might affect health outcomes, markers of health outcomes, some satiety and sensory aspects, like we saw in that study on the apple, chicken, and peanut beverage versus soup versus whole food, and even things like taste, price, convenience. What is the impact of processing on those factors? Because these we know are the focuses for consumers. Consumers primarily choose foods that taste good, that are affordable, that are accessible, and that are convenient. And so how can we focus nutrition research so that the priorities actually overlap with what consumers are looking for? So that would be my bold idea for the food matrix research, to tie it in with the discussions on processing, which right now focus so much on the ingredient list on the food. Can we also look at the physical structure of the food, how that might be playing into the health outcomes too?
Amazing. I love that. Thank you, Julie. I'm next going to turn it over to Dr. Tia Rains.
Hi, everyone. So Tia Rains, my background is nutrition science, PhD from University of Illinois, and have spent the last 25 plus years in different roles within, I would say, the food industry and food industry adjacent. So by that, I mean, I have worked for a large CPG. I currently work for an ingredient supplier. I also worked for the American Egg Board, which I'm excited to talk about when it comes to food matrix, because I think that's another great example of where we've had a lot of learnings over time by focusing on this reductionist approach of cholesterol to now opening it up and looking at the entire egg and the benefits, or the benefits that the egg may have beyond just one of these nutrients. And then I also worked in a clinical research role where all I did was 10 to 15 clinical studies per year in support of mostly food or food ingredients, as well as some pharmaceutical. So happy to be here today to be part of this discussion. And then my bold idea is, I think we have an opportunity here with this food matrix research to almost carve out sort of a hybrid science, if you will, because it is that intersection of food science, really understanding the food chemistry, as well as nutrition science. And I think bringing those together could help us kind of define an expertise that separates us from the self-proclaimed experts out there, which I know if you are in the field of nutrition, you feel that burden of people self-proclaiming and then spouting out information. But I think this area here is unique. It does require kind of those two hats of food science and nutrition. And I'm hopeful that by rallying around this concept, we could start to differentiate from the non-experts out there who unfortunately over time have garnered a lot of credibility that they haven't earned or deserve. So that's my bold idea. Thanks.
Perfect transition into our next panelist, Janet Helm.
Okay. Hi, I'm Janet Helm. I am a registered dietitian, culinary professional, and I've really spent the bulk of my career in public relations as a public relations strategist. So, and also a nutrition journalist. So I spend a lot of my time really thinking about the consumer. How do we reach the consumer? How do we inspire the consumer? How do we educate the consumer on some, often in this case, some complex nutrition topics? How do we translate that into something that's memorable and meaningful to them? So my thought is, I was really struck with, I love the theme of this webinar of look beyond the label. I think we also need to go beyond the grams. So when we look at saturated fat, the research that looked at butter versus cheese may have the same amount of saturated fat, but it's that structure of cheese that made all the difference. So I think that that is a new concept for the consumer, that just like not all ultra-processed foods are created equal, not all saturated fat is created equal. So the thought of the food sources of saturated fat can make all the difference, and that really comes at it from the food matrix.
Thank you, Janet. And now we're going to turn over to some of our innovators. I'm going to start with Stephanie and Hallie Painter from Painter Lancaster Yogurts.
Hi, everyone. Everyone here is such an inspiration. My sister, Haley, and I, we started Pearland Sisters to create a stabilization for our family's fourth generation organic regenerative dairy farm. And with that, as we went out into the world, we realized consumers were completely they just didn't understand where the source of their food was or their food at all. And so we really are utilizing our yogurt. So we picked organic skyr yogurt because it was the most premium dairy product that we could find at that time. And we still believe that. It has up to 21 grams protein, lactose free. Well, in our research, 68% of people have some sort of lactose sensitivity, and we wanted everyone to enjoy real dairy. And that it has billions of probiotics. We use a BB12 pack, very low in sugar. So we just use a little bit of organic cane sugar and the natural berries. So we wanted to basically keep this as close to nature as possible, represent farmers, represent our cows and what it means, what you're doing to the soil and the land and how that can go right through the animal, through the milker, through the yogurt making process, right to our families, right? And so we're a certified woman-owned business as well. So 80% of the consuming buyer power is women. We are able to speak to that buying power where the majority of yogurt companies, they're really marketed and look pretty manly, let's say. And so we're able to relate in a fun and interactive way to the buying power as a woman-owned, farmer-owned brand. And so we're selling about 600,000 yogurts a week at this point. It's our third year of business. We're in all 50 states, and we're in about 6,000 retail locations. We're using the yogurt as the conduit to make the change and to educate. And so being in this room, we're really looking to understand as much as possible so that we can be that conduit for the education, because buying power is really power in change. And that's my tidbit, but Haley has some more to add.
Yeah, and the reason we started the Painterland Sisters, our fourth generation farm was at risk of going out of business. We almost had to sell the cows. We, as fourth generation farmers in northern Pennsylvania, we grew up pretty poor, even though we worked, a lot of hours. Our family worked a lot of hours. And so we started Painterland Sisters as a way to make a sustainable milk market. And when we say sustainable, it's really about, in order to keep these farms farming for generations to come, to keep the family farm around. That's part of our definition of sustainable, and why we really got aggressive, and we needed to have a product that we could launch at a large enough scale. And the niche in the market was a full fat yogurt that kept all the nutrients in it. So often on the yogurt space, you'll see trends of high protein, but then the taste kind of lacks, or it's, high sugar, or you'll see really tasty, but it doesn't have the protein and the lactose free and all the other attributes. And so we wanted like the most nutrient dense product we could get. And so it really came out of a place of need. And so as we're getting into this space, our goal is to really change and be a voice in the food system, to create more diversity, to empower our farmers to be more stable, to see more food brands on the shelves that have access to different nutrient profiles, so our consumers can really have that lens of who your farmer is and the power of choice. And so when we're thinking about our bold idea, it first starts with education. And so we're really eager to learn and hear more information on why full fats are good for you. We started full fats. I studied personally ruminant nutrition in college as my undergrad. And we wanted to bring a full fat product to the world, and we're still having trouble being able to explain that to consumers. We hear a lot of feedback that our consumers have to stop eating our product because their doctor says that it's causing them to have higher cholesterol. And we want to have a robust amount of information to say why it's good for you and why we keep the other nutrients in our product, and they play and interact to create a balanced gut. And that's why if you eat our yogurt, even if you can't digest anything else, like sometimes having those nutrients interact, it allows your body to digest it if you wouldn't by itself. So sometimes you need fat in order to digest protein. Why is that? So that's a place where our big bold idea is And it really goes into also having this food matrix in our animal agriculture space as well. Here are the trends of grass-fed diets or full grain-fed. And to me, both of them irritate me because I want to hear the trend of a healthy cow. And with a healthy cow, how does that change your profile of healthy milk? And so that's really can ripple and have your food matrix go to the top animal agriculture products and why what their food matrix and what their consumption affects our end consumers. So that's our big, bold idea. And we're excited to see change in this system. And we see it here today. So thank you for leading that change.
Thank you. And last but definitely not least, we've got Melissa. I'm going to hand it over to.
Hi, everybody. Melissa Martinelli. Humbled to be here with all of these real experts. I am by far not an expert in this whatsoever, but I am the founder of Superfrau. Superfrau means superwoman in German, and it's a product that's inspired by a popular drink in Europe made with liquid whey. And what we do is we partner with amazing yogurt manufacturers like Stephanie and Haley. And when you make a Greek style yogurt or skyr, often 2/3 of the milk, this nutritious, delicious milk that was milked by hard farm workers and produced by healthy cows, goes to waste. And so we were capturing that liquid whey and making other products out of it. And our first product was a soda alternative that tasted delicious and has a lot of health benefits. I think where I've been living for the last several years is how do we communicate this with the consumer? So my bold thoughts on this are really, oh, wow, but there's so much research that has been done. There's so much research to do. And part of that needs to be how do we communicate that with the consumer in a way that's digestible? Because sorry, there's a thunder and lightning storm happening here right now. I don't know if you guys can hear that. So hopefully it's not disrupting this. But I was living I have been living in a space where I wanted so badly to communicate all the health benefits of this liquid whey. Hippocrates, the founder of medicine, was prescribing liquid whey to his patients over 2,000 years ago. He's the original food as medicine. But I am not an expert in this. I'm not a scientist. So I was going to nutritionists and researchers and saying, all right, how do we get this information out there? And finding that there isn't much research on it, A, and B, we don't have the right language to communicate it to the consumer. And the consumer, yes, is focused on taste, but they are looking more and more at the labels. So what can we do to communicate this in a way that's easy? Is there, a bioactive chart instead of a nutrition facts panel? Or what is it? Is it a QR code where you can see how this is going to interact with your body? But this must be communicated on labels in a way that is digestible for consumers who can really make decisions. Because honestly, hearing this as a consumer and not as an expert, I was going back to the Michael Pollan quote was, eat food, mostly plants, not too much, because it's so overwhelming. And I think a lot of consumers feel that way. A lot of parents feel that way when they're going to feed their children. I feed my kids Greek yogurt. I feed my kids Painterland Sisters yogurt because I feel comfortable knowing that this is good stuff. But there's so much stuff out there that I'm afraid to feed my children. So we need to do better about communicating this important information with consumers. So that's my bold idea, and really excited to be here with all of you and learn and hear more.
Wow, thank you so much. So I'm going to start with a couple pointed questions to each of you, and then open it up to some questions that maybe you can all answer, and then move on to our Q&A. Julie, you kind of answered some of my question, but I wonder if there's any additions you want to make. As a USDA scientist, you're at the heart of where science meets policy. How do you envision Food Matrix research informing the future of federal dietary guidance? And I loved your bold idea around that question. And then the second really piece of that question is, what are the opportunities and the challenges of incorporating this evolving science into evidence-based recommendations that really serve all Americans?
Thanks, Dana. Those are really good and very big questions. And I'm glad that Melissa handled part of them for me. I think the communication piece is really where I see this research and policy intersection primarily happening. We need so much more research on this topic. So I think that's both a challenge and an opportunity, because like I talked about in my presentation, even the most recent Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee report didn't find that there was really enough data for them to say, there's something to this food matrix concept. This really needs to be part of the policy document. So I think that's part of the reason we haven't seen it come through in policy yet. But it is really tricky trying to figure out this piece of how to communicate this science to consumers when we've had this kind of reductionist focus for the past decades of nutrition policy. People are used to looking at sodium on food labels. I mean, the new front of pack labels that were proposed by the FDA, I think those were open for comment just last month. Those really focus on the nutrients to limit in a food, and they don't look at that whole food overall and its potential impact on health. So I'm not sure what we do exactly, because it's a really tricky challenge to navigate through. That there's this emerging area of science. We know that there's something there and something happening. How do we bring it to the next step? And then how do we talk to consumers through this process? Because while we're figuring out science, people have to keep eating. So I'm not sure how best to do that, but hopefully some of the other folks on the panel can weigh in on this one too.
Yeah. Tia, first of all, I loved your idea of this kind of hybrid science. You've been on the front lines of public health through some of nutrition's most complex chapters, from the cholesterol debate around eggs, as you've mentioned, to persistent myths about MSG. How can food matrix science help us avoid repeating history and build stronger, more resilient public health messages that withstand scientific evolution and media noise?
Thank you for the question. Maybe just grounding everybody first on eggs, and I'll use that as an example. Just as a reminder, eggs were widely consumed in our past globally, certainly within North America, until really in the 60s, when we had this fear that the cholesterol in eggs was going to be harmful to cardiovascular health. And I think that's when everybody, I think, lost their mind a little bit when it came to looking at the relationship between eggs and health, because all we did was focus on the cholesterol component for decades and decades and decades. If you go into PubMed and put in eggs and cardiovascular or eggs and cholesterol, there are probably hundreds of studies now that have been conducted that are looking at that relationship. And so what that did, so the impact of that, besides egg consumption decreasing precipitously, is we stopped thinking of the egg as a whole food, and we started thinking about it just as this carrier for dietary cholesterol. And it turns out that there's a whole bunch of interesting components within the egg that impact health, all different aspects of health. One of the studies I'm most familiar with, because when I was at the American Egg Board, I was part of the team that approved it for funding from a research grant, was a team at University of Illinois looked at the relationship between whole eggs and then just egg whites, same amount of protein, and then post-exercise muscle protein synthesis. And if we use that reductionist lens, we would have thought that the protein component of eggs would be the driver of muscle protein synthesis based on everything else that had been published in the literature. And so we would have expected, again, reductionist approach, that it would have been equivalent of protein provided post-exercise, that the muscle protein synthesis effect would be the same. But what the study showed is that after eating whole eggs, there was greater muscle protein synthesis than just with the egg whites. So then all of a sudden, there's something in the food matrix. There's something within that package of the egg that is driving muscle protein synthesis beyond just the protein content. And that was really one of the first moments or ahas that we had at the Egg Board to go, wow, we've really been missing or not thinking about this package. What else could be there that we should be investigating that might be relevant or important for health? And that research has gone on, and other labs have looked at longer term feeding studies, and I encourage you to look at that work. The take home message is it's okay to eat whole eggs after exercise if you're trying to build muscle. It's not just about the protein component. So my point is that, by focusing so much on just one or two components, we're missing sort of what is happening more broadly. And then Julie brought this up a couple times. People eat food. They eat food, and they make food choices, not just for nutrition, but they make food choices that are based on what's accessible and what's affordable and what tastes good. I think often in nutrition discussions, we forget the taste component, that people are picking things that work with their lifestyle because they enjoy the taste of them. And then the other piece that we often forget is that there's a lot of cultural considerations when it comes to making food choices. So, we may eat, I work for a Japanese company. My colleagues from Japan come here, they go to the grocery store and they stand in front of the yogurt section with their mouth open, because the yogurt section in Japan is about, like two SKUs wide. And you go here to a major retailer and, it can be 25 feet long, all different kinds of yogurts, but it's culturally appropriate. That section is small in Japan. They just are not high yogurt consumers, and culturally appropriate here. So that's the other nuance. So I think looking forward, we have to sort of think about, more broadly, like what is the impact of all of these different elements on making food choices, health being one of them. And then certainly we need to think about how we're going to study these foods, because that's a piece that we haven't talked about yet, that when you're studying the impact of a certain food or a dietary pattern, there's a trade-off there in terms of not eating something else. So if you're going to be looking at the benefits of eggs, whatever it is on some aspect of health, what are people not eating? Or what is a suitable control if you're going to be testing it in a controlled trial? What is the impact on different cooking techniques, or what the age of the egg? Like all of a sudden the complexity there starts to ratchet up. And I think it just is going to require a very careful and considerate communication approach. Maybe I'm teeing up Janet a little bit here, because explaining that complexity in a way that, again, going back to my big, bold idea, allows us to maintain our expertise and be the experts on this conversation. But certainly helping people make choices based on that research, I think that's going to be the challenge with this idea. Thanks.
Awesome. Yes, and turning it over to Janet next. Janet, consumers are bombarded with nutrition headlines that are often simplistic, sensationalized, or just plain wrong. What's the smartest way to communicate the complexity of the food matrix in a way that breaks through the clutter and builds understanding rather than confusion?
Well, good question, because it is a complex topic and consumers are looking for simplicity, and this is good, this is bad. And they're getting their advice, as Tia, you said earlier, from a lot of unqualified people. And we're kind of in this era of anti-science, anti-authority as well. So I think and we've talked a lot about this reductionist approach that we have. On the other end of that, we have this nutrient hero worshiping going on too. So we have this nutrition isolation, and right now it's protein. So I think people are so focused on getting 100 grams of protein a day that they're not looking at the package of the food that's coming in. Or now it's all about fiber. Fiber maxing is a trend. I don't know if you know about fiber maxing. So now fiber. So I think that is losing sight of the overall picture, the package of where they're getting that protein, where they're getting that fiber. And I think, which has been said many times already, we eat food, not nutrients. And we need to put the focus back on that structure of the food, the overall package of the food. And I think, some ways to communicate this. I love an analogy. Allison, you talked about the symphony. I love that. I think, how do we put this complex topic into ways that a consumer can understand? So the idea of food as a symphony, it's not a solo. I think we're so much in that solo space of the nutrient isolation that we're doing. So nutrients don't work alone. They interact like instruments in the orchestra, Allison, that you talked about. It's the harmony that matters, not just the soloist. I think the other way, thinking about, looking at it as food, as not a list of nutrients, again, going beyond the label, but as a tightly woven fabric. The nutrients are the threads, but it's how they're woven together, with the fiber, with the fats, the proteins, those bioactive compounds. I mean, I think we need to raise total more awareness of the bioactive compounds in food. And I think it is overlooked in dairy as far as the bioactive compounds. So I think looking at how do we really paint that picture, or it's a building and these are blocks, but it's not just the individual blocks. So, it is that structure. I think also with the narrative right now on ultra processed foods, people, don't quite understand it. What is the definition? Is it the NOVA classification? But also NOVA does not take into account nutrition at all. Is this a way to talk about the processing of food, but also how that intersects with the nutrients, the bioactives in food, and to really make more sense of that, and to understand of, the impact of maybe processing on the structure of a food, but don't isolate out the nutrients as part of that discussion. So I think it's going to maybe help with that narrative, which there's a lot of consumer confusion right now, I think, on ultra processed foods.
I attempted to answer a question. My last sort of frame question here is to Stephanie, Hallie, and Melissa. So from farm to the shelf, how can innovators and producers apply food matrix principles to create products that are both nutritionally impactful and environmentally sustainable? How can the science inspire smart solutions that meet the moment? And you all kind of touched on this really, really well. And I just want to hear if you have further thoughts.
I'll go first just because I'll be quick, I think. I think we have a very unique and important role because we're on the front lines of communicating with the consumers. So we have to be wise and not miscommunicate things. I think a lot of I think a lot of innovators don't necessarily understand that responsibility, how important it is. And there, as everybody has been touching on, there's so much miscommunication out there. So it's an important role, but we are on the front line. So I think it needs to be a collaboration, which is why I love the Food and Nutrition Innovation Council. It's a cross section of everyone in this system, and we all need to learn from each other. And we're making if you look at Stephanie and Haley's Instagram, like they are really connecting with consumers. So if you want to communicate a message about health, like talk to Stephanie and Haley, and they'll be able to communicate it. We have this opportunity with our packaging every moment, multiple times a day, or in the store, somebody just walking down the street. It's really an educational opportunity. So everybody just needs to work together to make sure the the right information is getting across, and also that it's really making a difference. I mean, I think Olipop is a great example of this, because no one understood really gut health until this product came out, and everyone's like, oh, that's, I like soda and it's a better for you soda. Oh, and it's good for your gut. Like, great. So maybe there's a back way to get to a consumer it just has to be so simple. No one has time. Everybody wants to eat. Everyone is eating multiple times a day, but no one has time to think about how complex this is. So how can we be simple? And I think Haley and Stephanie's messaging is simple. Our messaging is not simple. So I'm still trying to figure out what that is. But I think that's our unique opportunity and responsibility. So I'll pass the mic.
I couldn't agree more, Melissa. Like, you nailed it. It's about how we communicate and what we communicate. And Haley and I are really excited for this year, and it actually lines up perfectly with the timing of this lunch right now, because we've been our first responsibility was figuring out how to basically save our family's farm, right? And keep farmers farming so that we had a product. Now we have this product, and now we're like, we are selling this product 600,000 units a week. And, we're just in our third year of business next year, tripling, continuing to rock and roll. So what does that mean? Well, that means like we feel like every single yogurt that we sell is an opportunity to tell a story. And like, what story do we need to tell? And how do we need to also like make it fun and relatable? So people are like, hey, like, look at this claim or look at this sentence right here. I want to dig into more. I want to go to their Instagram. I want to go to their blogs. I want to go to their website. And then we can link other great information that you are all here gathering that data. It's just bite by bite, wanting consumers to actually dig into this information. But if you push it all out at the same time, all at once, it's how it's communicated. People freeze up. And we've seen it at shows. We've been to consumer shows, we've been to the food industry shows, and we get really geeky. Of course, we love this stuff. So we're like talking about agriculture. Well, if you just give people bits, then you start pulling them in and they want more information. So it's also about right now we're working on hiring 1 or 2 graphic designers, because how we present this information and making it cute and relatable and like super easy to digest, not like, just like the food, but also like quick, like people just want quick snippets of stuff. They want to see how it relates to their daily life. They want not just pictorial versions of those explanations, but like they want to see, we're a mother-owned company. My 3 kids, I'm pregnant again right now. Like, how is she doing it? And like, how does that relate to my life? Like, they care about themselves, but it's, so it's really like understanding that and figuring out, like you said, Melissa, like we have a serious responsibility of that. There's so much information out there. So many different brands are saying so many different things. And then you have the influencers layered on top of that are just, taking their messaging and just pushing it out. And so like Haley and I specifically, we really want to make sure that we're saying the right things and exemplifying those things. And we're at the point in our company where we're like, okay, we've gotten to the base, like how can we do this as responsibly as possible? And not just for the consumers that are buying it, but so they can start providing this information to their children. Like we have a coloring page on the back of our yogurt that you can rip off, because you start with snippets of information. And the mommy, what does this mean? You know what I mean? Daddy, what does this mean? That's really important to us. It's all about communication, but having that communication be like fun and relatable to their lives, because at the end of the day, I think this is like marketing 101. They care about themselves, like we all do. You know what I mean? Like we're designed to protect ourselves as humans. And so I think, yeah, Haley, do you have anything to add to that? I think you nailed it, Melissa, though.
Yeah, I think you did a really great job. I think I'll add like or paint the picture, I guess, of the retail shelves. Like think about that 25-foot space of yogurt, for example, right? It feels overwhelming to everybody. But go again and look at it with the lens of 90% of the food on the grocery store shelves is owned by 10 brands. So although it looks like there's a lot of diverse options on the shelves, it's majority of those are really 10 brands who own a bunch of, or 10 companies who own a bunch of brands. And so once you wear that cap, now think of brands like Painterland Sisters, Olipop, Superfrau as change maker brands. Patagonia Provisions, they launched a food brand. These brands want to test the norm and challenge it. They're mission-based brands. Partnering with mission-based brands is a way that you can get the messages out there. Now, we as mission-based brands, we're new. We're startups. Funding is our number one area that we have difficulty with. Part of our food supply chain being a little broken. So it's hard for new brands to get funding. The one thing we don't want to do is get sued. And so if we can have basic FAQs and informational sheets on these nutrition points and start with protein. We all know protein's trending, but there's a lot of innovators in protein that take a lot of time to research and dive in. And then they share that out on their Instagrams. And so if we have a basic sheet on protein, then as food brands, as change maker brands, we'll push on that concept of protein to relate how it is a little more, how it affects it. And I think with the vegan culture diet, the bioavailability is kind of present in consumers' minds because they know they have to choose protein from different elements. So we can use protein as the base to show the segue into how this is so complex and how you need a little bit of everything to digest it, and use food brands like us to do that. And then go to those top 10 companies that own all these different brands. All those brands, they usually have one that's a 2%, a full fat. They have everything. So you give them the basic talking points. And that's what we really need as a food brand, is that basic information that we can like spin and play and push. So that's what we're really working on this year in our company is getting that credibility. So we're excited to dive more into different experts like people like you on this call, but also to work with the extension programs and the land-grant universities. That's the challenge, is when we say something as a food brand like, hey, no, cholesterol and yogurt, with the high-fat yogurt, it's really not pushing it. We need the credibility of a doctor, scientist, and the land-grant schools. Even if it's just one, now we have our check mark and our safety net. So I hope that was helpful, and thank you for asking us the questions.
Awesome. I want to be mindful of time and open it up to other participants on this call who could ask questions. Lots of great discussion in the chat that I'm really grateful for.
There we all are. And I just want to say I'm mindful that it's 1:55 and people tend to cycle off as they go to 2:00 meetings. So let's have a little bit of conversation. But if people do need to go, we're not going to be offended. We get that. But anyone who's got a burning question, comment, they'd really like to do, like wave your arms. Ellen Brown, I see you waving your arms.
I'm looking all raggedy today. I wasn't.
That's all right. You look great, girl.
That I was going to be able to join this call. Katie knows me well, so. But it's substance over whatever. So hair is raggedy. More importantly, I guess what really struck me at the end is Katie's very familiar, but Carter Williams and I are partnered really closely. We've created the Food is Health Substack, and I normally wouldn't take a place like this to talk about it. But what's been really fascinating is those of you that nodded your head that are subscribers probably, you may have noticed that lately Carter's been putting these like book time with us little links in there. And what's blown my mind is that we have had a number of funds actually set up time proactively with us because they want to hear about the innovation that we are reading about, learning about, hearing about. So it would be really great for us to be conveners for you guys. So as I'm hearing this, I'm realizing that we need to be better leveraging the Substack for that. So if you have stuff that you want us to know about, like just shoot us a note, shoot us an email, make sure you're a subscriber too. And it's free. Like I'm not trying to sell my wares here. But it's really important because we got over that 1,000 subscriber mark, and it's made a big difference with traction and who's showing up, and it's really high quality people, and I've been kind of blown away myself. So anyways,
Thank you.
I'll put the like link in there in case you don't, but I want to help this. Katie knows, like, this is my passion. I sort of walked away from the underbelly of healthcare to use my knowledge to try to help food really take over healthcare, because you can if you want to.
And Ellen's also the co-chair of our Food is Health Working Group, by the way, too, on our.
Yeah, I brushed my hair really well before that call, so I'm going to go back off camera.
Thank you. That was super helpful. So in the interest of time, I will close this out, but I'm happy to share people's emails and continue this discussion. Ellen, I appreciate you offering like another platform to kind of address some of these issues. I want to just thank all of our brilliant panelists for your insights, ideas, and inspirations, and to everybody who joined today. If there's one takeaway from today's conversation, it's this, that the way we talk about food is evolving, and it should. The Food Matrix reminds us that nutrition is more than the numbers on the label. It's about the whole food, it's about how it's built, and it's about how it works in the body. So this science opens up exciting possibilities to communicate better, to innovate smarter, to protect public health, and guide people towards nourishing choices that work in the real world. So whether you're a scientist, a health professional, a communicator, a food processor, you're part of this movement, and let's continue to ask bold questions, push for better answers, and keep food science grounded in both evidence and impact. And with that, I just want to say thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.